Part 1. The Century of Blood. Look closely at the image before you. A terrified, mud-covered French knight in heavy plate armor is looking up in absolute shock and despair. Above him, a massive, sky-darkening cloud of arrows is raining down on the battlefield, blotting out the sun. For centuries, we have been told that the Middle Ages were a time of noble chivalry, grand tournaments, and highly honorable combat between gentlemen. We are taught that knights fought by a strict moral code, where captured enemies were treated with the utmost respect and ransomed back to their families. But this terrifying image captures the exact moment that romantic illusion was violently shattered. Over the course of 116 grueling years, the two most powerful kingdoms in Western Europe, England and France, engaged in the longest and most devastating military conflict in medieval history. It was a ruthless, generational bloodbath that completely destroyed the strict rules of feudalism and dragged Europe into a terrifying new era of war. In this documentary, we are going to expose the hidden truth of the 100 Years' War. You will witness how the rapid-fire English longbow slaughtered the flower of French nobility and ended the golden age of the mounted knight. You will discover the apocalyptic Chevauchée raids, a brutal, scorched earth tactic that intentionally burned the French economy to the ground and targeted innocent civilians. You will see the shocking madness of a French king who firmly believed his own body was made of fragile glass. And you will experience the unbelievable, miraculous rise of a teenage peasant girl named Joan of Arc, who stepped onto a battlefield dominated by men and ultimately saved a broken nation from total annihilation. But most importantly, you will discover how this century of endless slaughter permanently reshaped the map of the world. It forged professional standing armies, introduced the destructive power of gunpowder artillery, and gave birth to the strong, fiercely independent national identities of England and France that we know today. To understand how this unprecedented chaos began, we must step away from the battlefield and look inside the royal courts. Because the longest war in European history did not start with an invasion. It started with the ultimate, catastrophic family feud. Part 2. The Ultimate Family Feud, the Royal Crisis. To understand the origins of this massive conflict, we must travel back to the early 14th century. At this time, the Kingdom of France was the wealthiest, most populated, and most powerful nation in all of Western Christendom. However, a highly volatile political crisis had been quietly brewing for generations. In the year 1328, the French King Charles IV died at the age of 33. He left behind no living male heir to inherit his throne. His widow, Queen Joan of Arc, was heavily pregnant at the time of his death, leaving the entire kingdom in a state of anxious suspension. Everyone waited for 2 agonizing months to see if she would deliver a boy who would instantly become the new king. But when the queen gave birth to a baby girl named Blanche, the direct line of the powerful Capetian dynasty was officially broken. The French throne was suddenly vacant. Across the English Channel, the young King Edward III of England watched this crisis very closely. Through his mother, Isabella of France, who was the sister of the late French king, Edward possessed a very strong, direct blood claim to the French crown. From the English perspective, Edward was the rightful heir, but the French nobility absolutely refused to be ruled by a foreign English monarch. To block Edward from taking power, French lawyers dug up an ancient, obscure legal code known as the Salic Law. They argued that the royal bloodline and the right to rule could never be passed down through a woman. Using this convenient legal loophole, the French assembly bypassed Isabella and Edward entirely. Instead, they handed the crown of France to a cousin, who ascended to the throne as King Philip VI. Edward was furious, but he was young, and his position in England was not yet fully secure. In a deeply humiliating political maneuver, the new French king summoned Edward to the Cathedral of Amiens in 1329. Because the English king was also the Duke of Aquitaine, a massive and incredibly lucrative wine-producing territory in southwestern France, Edward was technically a vassal to the French crown. He was forced to travel to France, kneel before Philip VI, and publicly pay homage to his rival. The tension was unbearable, and it only took one exiled troublemaker to light the match. Robert of Artois was a powerful French nobleman who had been exiled from Paris after a bitter inheritance dispute with King Philip. Seeking revenge, Robert fled to England and became one of Edward's closest military advisors. Robert constantly whispered in Edward's ear, providing him with top-secret intelligence about the French court and urging him to launch a full-scale invasion to take back his rightful crown. According to a famous legend and a satirical poem known as the Vow of the Heron, Robert humiliated King Edward at a royal banquet. He presented the English king with a roasted heron, calling it the most cowardly of all birds, and declared it was a fitting gift for a king who was too cowardly to fight for his rightful inheritance in France. Whether this exact banquet happened or not, the message worked perfectly. Driven by national pride, dynastic ambition, and the desperate need to protect the highly profitable English wool trade with Flanders, Edward finally snapped. In 1337, when King Philip attempted to confiscate the Duchy of Aquitaine, Edward publicly declared himself the true king of France and prepared his armies for war. The fragile peace was shattered, and the century of blood had officially begun. Part 3. The Chevauchée. To conquer a nation as vast and wealthy as France, the English realized that traditional military conquests and protracted castle sieges would be far too slow and astronomically expensive. Instead, King Edward III and his commanders authorized a brutal, highly organized strategy of economic terrorism known as the Chevauchée. A Chevauchée was a fast-moving, large-scale mounted raid designed to weaken the enemy by systematically burning and pillaging their territory. The English forces deliberately avoided prolonged engagements and bypassed heavily fortified castles. Instead, columns of light cavalry and mounted men-at-arms swept through the undefended countryside, striking isolated villages, manors, agricultural centers, and abbeys. Their primary goal was absolute destruction rather than permanent military occupation. By burning crops, looting granaries, and slaughtering livestock, the English directly disrupted tax collection and halted local trade. This intentional devastation starved the French war machine of its vital financial resources. But within the broader context of medieval warfare, the Chevauchée served a much more sinister psychological and political purpose. Under the strict rules of the feudal system, a lord was obligated to protect his vassals and peasants in exchange for their loyalty and taxes. As the English army burned the countryside to ash, they effectively demonstrated to the local inhabitants that the French king and his nobles were completely powerless to protect them. If the French lords could not defend their own lands, the loyalty of their subjects would quickly shatter, severely eroding trust in the royal government. The most notorious of these campaigns was the Grand Chevauchée of 1355, led by Edward's son, the legendary Black Prince. Landing in Bordeaux, the Black Prince led an Anglo-Gascon force of roughly 5,000 men on a ruthless march across southern France. They traveled 300 miles to the Mediterranean coast of Narbonne, leaving a wide swath of utter devastation in their wake before returning west. While no permanent territory was captured, the economic attrition inflicted upon France was enormous. The English soldiers seized a massive amount of loot, crippled the regional economy, and caused a massive flight of terrified refugees into the walled cities. Through the smoke and ashes of the Chevauchée, the English forced the desperate French nobility to finally seek a decisive, pitched battle to defend their honor. And that battle would change the course of military history forever. Part 4. The Storm of Arrows. The ultimate clash of these two warring nations culminated on the rolling fields of northern France on August 26, 1346. King Edward III's English army was intercepted near the village of Crécy by a vastly superior French force commanded by King Philip VI. The French army relied heavily on the traditional shock factor of heavily armored, mounted knights. They firmly believed that warfare was a gentleman's pursuit, where expensive armor and noble blood guaranteed victory. But Edward III completely changed the rules of engagement. He anchored his men in a strong defensive position on a sloping hillside, ordering his knights to dismount and fight on foot. On the flanks, he positioned his ultimate weapon, thousands of low-born English and Welsh archers wielding the deadly longbow. The battle began with a disastrous advance by thousands of Genoese crossbow mercenaries hired by the French. A sudden rainstorm had dampened their crossbow strings, causing their heavy bolts to fall completely short of the English lines. Facing a rapid, overwhelming volley of English arrows, the terrified Genoese began to retreat. Contemptuous of what they perceived as cowardice from lowly mercenaries, the impatient French nobility ordered their cavalry to charge forward. The French knights brutally rode down and slashed their own retreating crossbowmen, plunging their vanguard into total chaos before they even reached the enemy. As the French heavy cavalry charged up the muddy hill, the English longbowmen unleashed a relentless, blinding storm of arrows. A highly trained longbowman could fire up to 12 arrows a minute, creating a continuous hail of armor-piercing steel. While the knights' armor offered some protection, their horses were completely unarmored and highly vulnerable. Arrows plunged into the charging mounts, sending the horses mad with pain. The massive beasts reared up, tossing their aristocratic riders into the deep mud. As the first wave collapsed, subsequent charges of French cavalry blindly crashed into the agonizing, seething mass of dead and dying horses, creating a horrific roadblock. Amidst this terrifying slaughter, John of Bohemia, a blind, 50-year-old king fighting for the French, demanded to strike one last blow. His loyal knights tied their horses' bridles together and guided the blind king directly into the thick of the fray, where they were all completely cut down and killed. By the end of the day, the flower of French nobility had been decimated, with over 1,500 elite knights lying dead in the mud. At the Battle of Crécy, the terrifying power of the longbow proved that a common peasant standing hundreds of feet away could easily kill the wealthiest aristocrat. It was the bloody, definitive beginning of the end of chivalry. Part 5. The Madness of the Glass King. As the 100 Years' War dragged into its later decades, the Kingdom of France desperately needed strong, unified leadership. Instead, they got a psychological nightmare. King Charles VI ascended to the throne as a young boy, but his reign was soon overshadowed by a severe and terrifying mental illness. The first true sign of his descent into madness occurred in the summer of 1392. While riding with his army through the forest of Le Mans in the punishing heat, a mysterious old man in white suddenly approached the king, screaming that Charles had been betrayed. Shortly after, a page accidentally dropped a lance against a helmet, creating a loud clanging noise. The sudden sound caused the king's mind to completely snap. Screaming about traitors, Charles drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing a knight and several soldiers before he was finally wrestled to the ground. This was only the beginning. Charles developed a bizarre and historically famous psychosis known as the glass delusion. He became absolutely convinced that his entire body was made of fragile glass. Terrified that he would accidentally shatter into pieces, the king wore clothing reinforced with iron rods and frantically forbade his advisors from coming near him or touching him. His condition deteriorated so rapidly that he once went 5 months without bathing or changing his clothes. He forgot his own name, forgot he was king, and could not even recognize his own wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. In 1393, the Queen attempted to cheer him up by hosting a raucous masquerade ball, which went down in history as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men. The king and 5 courtiers dressed up as wild men, wearing costumes made of linen soaked in highly flammable pitch and frayed flax. Tragedy struck when the king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, drunkenly approached the dancers with a lit torch. A spark ignited the costumes, instantly turning the men into human torches. 4 noblemen burned to death in agony. Charles was only saved because a quick-thinking teenage duchess threw her heavy skirts over him to smother the flames. This horrific event, combined with the king's recurring madness, created a massive power vacuum in France. Rival noble factions violently turned on each other, tearing the country apart from the inside and handing the English a golden opportunity to strike.
Part 6. The apocalypse pauses the war.
While the kings and knights of England and France were busy slaughtering each other for territory, nature unleashed a far more devastating enemy. In 1347, an invisible killer swept into Europe via the trade routes. It was the bubonic plague, known to history as the Black Death. Within a matter of years, this apocalyptic pandemic wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of the entire European population. The outbreak had an immediate and catastrophic impact on the 100 Years' War. Armies living in close, squalid quarters were the perfect breeding grounds for the disease. The massive loss of life forced the military campaigns to a grinding halt. The sheer devastation temporarily broke the war machines of both nations, forcing the desperate governments to sign temporary truces because there were simply not enough healthy men left to fight. However, the long-term consequences of the Black Death altered the very fabric of medieval society. With tens of millions of people dead, Europe experienced a severe and unprecedented labor shortage. For centuries, wealthy lords had relied on an endless supply of easily replaceable peasants to work their lands. Now, the surviving peasants quickly realized that their labor was incredibly valuable. They began to demand higher wages, and many simply ran away from their manors to find better opportunities in other villages. Terrified by this sudden shift in power, the English government panicked. In 1351, during the first parliament held after the plague, they passed the notorious Statute of Laborers. This drastic law attempted to force wages back down to pre-plague levels, specifically capping them at the rates paid in 1346. It made it a criminal offense for workers to demand higher pay, and legally bound able-bodied men and women under the age of 60 to serve whoever required their labor. But legislation could not stop the forces of supply and demand. The oppressive laws only fueled deep, burning resentment among the lower classes. This anger eventually boiled over into massive, violent uprisings, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The Black Death did not just pause the 100 Years' War. It broke the rigid chains of the feudal system, fundamentally shifting the balance of power between the rich and the poor forever. Part 7. Agincourt and the Mud of Death. The nightmare captured in our thumbnail image became a horrifying reality on the morning of October 25th, 1415. The new English king, Henry V, had led his army deep into northern France, but the campaign had been a miserable disaster. His forces were exhausted, starving, and ravaged by a severe outbreak of dysentery. Many of the English archers were so violently ill that they were forced to fight without their breeches or underwear, completely stripped from the waist down just to survive the battle. Blocking their path to safety was a massive French army of heavily armored knights, outnumbering the sick and starving English by a massive margin. But the French made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. They forced the battle to take place in a narrow, freshly plowed field that had been soaked by torrential autumn rains. When the English longbowmen unleashed their massive storm of arrows, the French cavalry charged forward in a disorganized panic. The heavy horses and their riders slammed into the deep, soft mud. Once knocked to the ground, the heavily armored French knights found it almost impossible to get back up. The crush of bodies was so intense and the mud was so thick that many of the elite French nobility literally suffocated and drowned inside their own iron helmets. But the true horror of Agincourt came after the arrows stopped falling. Despite their incredible victory, the English were still heavily outnumbered and incredibly vulnerable. King Henry noticed that thousands of armed French prisoners were gathering in the rear, and he feared they might regroup, grab their weapons, and overrun his exhausted men. In a shocking violation of the honorable rules of chivalry, Henry ordered his men to slaughter the prisoners in cold blood. Because it was difficult to kill a knight in full plate armor, the English methodically removed their helmets or lifted their visors and butchered them with axes, hammers, and daggers. This absolute massacre crippled the French leadership. It eventually led to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a humiliating agreement where Henry V was officially named the heir to the French throne, establishing a dual monarchy over both kingdoms. France was entirely broken, and the English victory seemed absolute. But out of the ashes of this despair, the ultimate savior of France was about to emerge. And she was not a king, nor a knight. Part 8. Joan of Arc and the Peasant Revolution. By 1428, the situation for France was completely hopeless. The English had laid siege to the city of Orleans, the last major stronghold protecting the southern half of the country. The French nobility was deeply shell-shocked by the massacre at Agincourt, behaving with extreme caution, and too terrified to risk another head-on confrontation with the English. Into this atmosphere of absolute defeat stepped a 17-year-old illiterate peasant girl from the obscure village of Domremy. Her name was Joan of Arc. Joan claimed that she was guided by divine visions from the archangel Michael and various saints, instructing her to expel the English and crown the French prince. While her spiritual claims are legendary, modern historians recognize that her true impact on the 100 Years' War was profoundly military and psychological. Joan fundamentally understood something that the elite French generals did not. She realized that doing something and failing was far less detrimental to their survival than doing nothing at all. Furthermore, she was one of the very first commanders to fully grasp the potential of a terrifying new technology, gunpowder. While other generals still used early cannons like catapults to simply fire over castle walls, Joan concentrated her artillery fire directly against individual sections of the English fortifications to blast open physical breaches. At the Siege of Orleans, she used this heavy artillery to smash the English bastions and then personally led her men in aggressive, incredibly dangerous frontal assaults through the rubble. Her fearless aggression completely inverted the moral order of the battlefield. She transformed a dry, boring dynastic squabble between royal cousins into a passionate, popular war of national liberation. She made an army of habitual losers finally believe in themselves as winners. In just a few short months, she broke the siege of Orleans and paved the way for the French king to be crowned. But her reward for saving the nation was a brutal betrayal. Captured by her enemies, Joan was subjected to a sham trial orchestrated by a pro-English ecclesiastical court. She was denied legal counsel, bullied by her hand-picked enemies, and eventually convicted of heresy. In 1431, the girl who saved France was burned alive at the stake. She was dead, but the spark she ignited could not be extinguished. The final chapter of the 100 Years' War was about to be written, not with arrows, but with fire and brimstone. Part 9. The Rise of Gunpowder and Artillery. For over a century, the English longbow had completely dominated the battlefields of Europe. But as the 100 Years' War entered its final phase, a terrifying new sound began to drown out the whistle of falling arrows. It was the deafening, earth-shaking roar of gunpowder. The English had actually deployed primitive cannons much earlier in the war, notably at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. At that time, the weapons were small, highly inaccurate, and used primarily for their immense psychological impact, meant to terrify the unaccustomed French horses and men with their thunderous noise and smoke. But by the middle of the 15th century, this primitive technology had rapidly evolved into a highly precise and devastating instrument of death. The late French resurgence was largely driven by two brilliant brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau. Jean was a perfectionist with a highly methodical, mathematical mind. while his brother, Gaspard, was a master ballistician. Together, they completely revolutionized the French military machine. They standardized cannon calibers and pioneered the manufacturing of cast iron cannons, which were vastly superior to the older, weaker wrought iron designs. This monumental technological leap culminated in the final decisive engagement of the entire war, the Battle of Crécy, fought on July 17, 1453. The legendary English commander, John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, marched his advancing army into a perfectly orchestrated and devastating trap. Mistakenly believing that the French forces were retreating, Talbot ordered a hasty, headlong assault on a strongly fortified French encampment without waiting for his full reinforcements to arrive. He advanced bravely with his men, but the French were waiting behind their earthen walls with 300 field guns prepared by the Bureau brothers. The French artillery unleashed a continuous, searing barrage at point-blank range, obliterating the English reinforcements piecemeal as they desperately rushed into the valley. The carnage was unimaginable, with reports stating that single cannon shots were tearing through 6 men at a time. John Talbot was killed, and the English army was completely slaughtered. Castillon went down in history as the first major European battle ever won through the extensive, massed use of field artillery. The golden age of the armored knight charging gloriously across an open field was officially dead, permanently replaced by a terrifying new era of mechanical firepower. Part 10. The legacy that shaped modern Europe. With the crushing, bloody defeat at Castillon, the English finally surrendered. By October 1453, they had lost all of their continental possessions in France, except for the small, isolated port of Calais. The 100 Years' War, which had actually dragged on for 116 years, was finally over. The human and economic toll of this prolonged conflict was utterly apocalyptic. Over 500,000 French and English soldiers had perished in combat, and the French countryside had been turned into a barren, devastated wasteland by decades of relentless Chevauchée raids and mercenary violence. But from the ashes of this unprecedented devastation, the foundations of the modern world were born. The war permanently destroyed the old, decentralized feudal system. Monarchs realized they could no longer rely on unreliable, independent noblemen and their temporary peasant levies. Instead, both sides began funding professional, standing armies paid directly by the crown, which centralized political power and transformed France into a unified, modern state. In England, the constant conflict effectively severed their deep cultural and linguistic ties to the European continent. For centuries after the Norman conquest, the English ruling class had spoken French. But as anti-French sentiment grew during the war, the English language reclaimed its dominance, officially replacing French in Parliament and the law courts by 1362. Above all else, this century of blood forged a profound, enduring sense of national identity in both kingdoms. People no longer saw themselves merely as subjects of a local lord, but as unified citizens of a distinct, sovereign nation. The 100 Years' War was a crucible of unimaginable suffering and brilliant innovation. It buried the romantic myths of chivalry deep in the mud and replaced the elegant sword with the brutal cannon. It was a horrifying, agonizing transition, but it was the exact fire required to forge the modern nations of Europe. If you loved this deep dive into one of history's greatest turning points, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We will see you in the next chapter.